Welcome back and thank you for staying with KTN Prime. Now we want to dive into a conversation. As I'd mentioned earlier, a lot is happening in the country that is likely to reshape the future of where we are going in terms of politics. Just last Friday, we saw the Court of Appeal quash that decision by the Deputy Chief Justice Philomena Mwilu, which she had made on October 18th, to constitute a 3-judge bench to hear a petition challenging the removal of former Deputy President Rigathi Gachagua from office. Now, we saw Justice Daniel Musinga, Mumbi Ngugi and Francis Tuyot say that Mwilu did not have constitutional powers to appoint the 3-judge bench. And that's what we want to talk about. What exactly does this mean? Joining me to this particular discussion is my immediate right, George Kithi, an advocate. Good evening, Karibu Sana.
My pleasure, good evening.
Good evening to you, Karibu Sana. And next to him, Kevin Osido, Executive Director, County Governance Watch. Good evening, Karibu, as always.
To you too, Asante Sana.
All right, so let's begin with this. I mean, Osido, let me begin with you before we get to the nitty-gritties of law. What was your initial reaction after hearing this particular ruling on Friday?
Thank you so much, Ashley. My initial reaction was that probably the good professor of law would leave office, and that if we probably lived in a much more favorable and fair democratic country where the rule of law is paramount and that people respect the Constitution and that we do not have to play it politics or political all the time, then the most fairest thing would be that the Deputy President would probably resign and declare that, yes, I respect the Court of Appeal's rulings, and we look forward to seeing how the rule of law takes its course.
Okay.
Of course, these are assumptions that I am making, but I know that there is still the process of empanelment that the CJ has to do within the 14 days. Wakili will help us understand much more better, and that the rule of law must follow its due course. And the hope is that the politics of the day, like what we saw, zile pilka-pilkas are impeachment.
Yeah.
This one is happening, and before you know it, a name has been submitted, and before you even go through the CV of the good professor, the swearing date has been set, and before you even look at your calendar, the swearing is over.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping that we'll be able to, as we seek to live the Constitution and implement it in fully, that we'll be able to abide by its principles and also precepts of law. And yeah, that's my common understanding as a lay Kenyan.
Okay, as a lay Kenyan. And let's keep it coming to you. I mean, yes, it is a political process. We do know that. But from that particular ruling, that they questioned some issues and raised the fact that this particular role was supposed to be CJ's role, specifically. I mean, break it down to a normal layman like Osido and I. What does that mean?
Well, I think just to do justice to the question that you asked would be probably to contextualize why we're here and how we got here. During an election, the president and the deputy are joined to the hip, and therefore they have one ticket, the UDA ticket. What it will mean is that they ought to enjoy presidency of term of 5 years together. And that's what was presented to Kenyans. When they were voted into office, they ought to have stayed within the run of the term. But they didn't, because there was friction, there was political disagreements that went live until such a situation where they countermanded each other in public. And fast forward, yes, the deputy president was deposed of his office or from his office through a process that's quasi-political, quasi-judicial, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
And he was impeached. Fast forward to what is obtaining today will be that as the impeachment process was ongoing before Parliament or both houses, Gachagua went to court, and the public, members of the public, went to court too. About 6 or 7 cases were filed in various cases which were brought together, meaning they were consolidated.
Yeah.
The most important one that we should highlight is the Kurugoya one. The Kurugoya court stayed or stopped the process of impeachment by the, by Parliament. The Kurugoya High Court file was moved from Kerugoya to Nairobi, consolidated with the other files, and then there was an importation of the empaneling of the bench, meaning judges to be appointed to hear the case.
Yeah.
Ordinarily, they are uneven judges, meaning they're either 3, 5, or 7. The minimum of 3 was appointed at that time, and the empanelment was done by Deputy Chief Justice Muilu. The Constitution and the law provides for close the powers of empanelment, administrative empanelment of judges to the Chief Justice.
Okay.
So that's the facts. So the obtaining question here will be, if a function can be discharged by the Chief Justice, can the deputy discharge that function? I repeat, if a function can be discharged by the Chief Justice, can the deputy Chief Justice discharge that function? Now, I'll give you probably an analogy to that.
Okay.
The instant one will be, if the president can appoint a cabinet, can the deputy president appoint a cabinet? And the answer to the question will be no, the deputy president can't appoint ministers or cabinet.
Okay.
Reason is, it was specifically provided for as a function of the president. And that brings the question of what we call jurisdiction or powers as donated by law. The powers donated by law to empanel a bench or to appoint judges to hear a case is given to the Chief Justice. I think the interpretation by the Deputy Chief Justice then, if she consulted, and how she was convinced, is that because she's deputizing the Chief Justice, she can then discharge the function of the Chief Justice as a deputy. But then there are issues that come to the fore. Does it mean that the Deputy Chief Justice can assume the office of a Chief Justice? One, does the law separate the function of a Chief Justice and a deputy? And number 3 is, can you then act in the context of a Chief Justice if the Chief Justice is not there? And the answer is no. Because a Chief Justice is a substantive office and a Deputy Chief Justice a substantive office. The law pronounces itself on what the Chief Justice should do. The law pronounces itself on what the Deputy Chief Justice should do. Now here is the law. If something is not said, then it's omitted. I repeat, if something is not said by the law, then it's omitted. In fact, deliberately omitted. And therefore, if the law does not say your powers as a Deputy Chief Justice shall include appointing judges to a bench if the Chief Justice is not there, if that is not said, then you can't interpret it to be said. So if the law is silent, then you can't impute substance on silence. Which means this, that if the law is quiet on something, especially on powers of a public officer, the public officer has no obligation whatsoever to clothe himself with powers not donated directly by the law. So if the law doesn't say that you do something, then don't do it because you've not been told you can do it.
So in this case, what happens? Do we have ideally 2 deputy presidents, or is one illegitimate?
Good question. And if you do that, then you need to claw away all the way up to the Kerugoya court order, which had stopped the process. If you claw back and say, what then is the import of the court saying the Deputy Chief Justice did not have powers or jurisdiction to appoint the bench, it means at the time, because what happened is when the Kerugoya court case or file came to Nairobi, before the 3 judges, it had orders within it that were saying you cannot continue with the impeachment process. The 3 judges had not been appointed then. When they appointed, they presided over the decision of the Kerugoya court, which was interim in nature as at the time. And they said, no, they can proceed. So they basically set aside or removed the order. Meaning, therefore, if the 3 bench was illegally constituted and therefore illegitimate to preside over to make the decision to remove the judge, the orders of Kerugoya court, the orders of Kerugoya court ought to have subsisted. In fact, they ought to be subsisting now. Which means, therefore, that the process of impeachment was therefore illegal to the extent of the pronouncement of the Court of Appeal. The entire process.
Okay.
And this is what we say in law. If the process is invalid, the substance becomes invalid. Meaning, therefore, procedure is the handmaiden of law. Procedure is handmaiden of substance. Meaning, therefore, if the procedure is not followed, the substance is vulgarized, becomes illegitimate.
Okay.
And subsequently, what it means is the entire process subsequent to the appointment of the 3 judges by Mwilu was illegitimate, and we fall back to what happened before that illegitimate thing or act was committed. Meaning, we are going to where there were orders that do not impeach or proceed with impeachment. What it follows, therefore, even subsequent acts of appointment of a deputy president, because there ought to have been impeachment before the appointment of a deputy president.
Okay.
Even that act is illegitimate and illegal.
Okay.
So what is obtaining now, factually, would be that we have a deputy president sitting in office that is illegitimate or is seen to be legitimate by the law as matters stand. Remember, this decision can go to the Supreme Court and overturned. The Court of Appeal decision can go to the Supreme Court and overturned, and they can adopt the decision of the High Court, or they can stand with the decision of the Court of Appeal.
Okay.
And we hope, from legal practitioners' point of view, we hope that it goes to the Supreme Court so we sort out this thing once and for all, because there will be the question of what then is ultimate, the settled law in the context of Supreme Court. But it's more interesting. It gets more interesting because if you leave the Court of Appeal and go to the Supreme Court, you meet the CJ there and you meet the DCJ there to make a decision over a matter that they're conflicted in. One had powers, or is said to have powers, and one exercised power that is said not to have had the powers. So it even becomes more convoluted when it gets to the Supreme Court. And I would love to see how they behave themselves in that context. But coming back to what is more interesting to Kenyans will be, is Professor Kindiki properly in office? And what happens to him? There are questions that are obtaining in law as to whether he's legally in office. But of course, until this issue is settled, I think there will be the issue of public interest as to whether he can continue to occupy office, because somebody has to be there to discharge office. Again, it is impossible now, with the decibels, political decibels that we see today, to have Rigathi Gachagua go occupy that office. In fact, because factually it's impossible. By law, it looks like theoretically possible, but in fact it is impossible. Okay. Now, when you come to the obtaining situation now in law, in court, what should be the expectation? The expectation ought to be that the 3 bench is reconstituted, 3 judges are appointed afresh.
Different ones?
Yes,
okay.
Apart from those 3 that were already appointed by, say, illegally appointed by the Chief Justice. The Deputy Chief Justice. Yeah. Now it has to be done by the Chief Justice exercising her rightful powers, so that then the process of impeachment starts, the process of hearing where the impeachment process was legally instituted starts afresh. The result will be either to say it was the impeachment process would have continued properly, or was not properly anchored in law. Now, but that is not the end. There's still another problem.
Okay.
The other problem is, notwithstanding what the court says, whether it was right or wrong, it has already invalidated the previous process that removed Gachagua. Either way, therefore, whether a new bench is constituted to make a determination, the first bench did not make did not have powers to make a determination at all. So if the impeachment process already determined, such as that Professor Kindiki was appointed into office, that one has to be set aside completely by default of the pronouncement of the Court of Appeal. Okay. It therefore illegitimizes the occupier of the office to continue occupying it. So we must have a new process and set off afresh, and if it says you can now impeach, they have to impeach afresh. Unless then, in the circumstances, a court adopts the impeachment that happened and therefore differs with what the Court of Appeal has said, which can only be done by the Supreme Court. Already I've said, at the Supreme Court, we have a problem. Yeah.
Okay, so it's a quagmire, if I may call it. But Osido, coming to you, I mean, yes, if I understand correctly what Kithi said, then it means ideally, we do not have a deputy president, quote unquote. But looking at this particular government, it's a government that does not really follow court orders. So how practical is what he's saying?
Again, going back to the space of politics in all this, because were it not for the political overtures and underplays in our democratic space as a country, I believe that Professor Kindiki, being, in my view, a gentleman who is not very close to contradictions, you know, he looks to me as quite averse to issues that are very violent and that really would wish to send someone to those murky, muddy waters of playing politics and the rule of law. Now, if he was a gentleman who really wanted to just follow the rule of law and say, anyway, the courts have spoken, and this is me as professor of law, Professor Kithure Kindiki, that majority leader and the Senate and all that, I leave this thing. But the politics in all these narrations, and one of the things that I really wanted even Wakili to share is, as at the point in time when these three judges were making the rulings, you know, what is it that, did somebody put a gun on their heads? What is it that happened? Because you know very well that the Constitution, I think that article is Article 165(4), that expressly gives the Chief Justice those powers. So you, the Deputy Chief Justice and the judges. So what is this thing? And in that, I read a lot of politics. That even as you are glued to the screens, and interestingly, actually, you have a way of pairing Wakili and myself, especially when interesting things are happening. Because I remember that Tuesday of impeachment, the two of us were here. Yeah. Actually, the three of us plus yourself, we were here. Yeah. And here we are again talking about this similar issue. So given the political undertones and the manner in which we see the politicians taking over even constitutional implementation, and you rightfully said issues of impunity and dire disregard to court orders is really almost synonymous to the actions that we see some very high-level politicians in this government following through. Now, that might want to cloud the faces and eyes of Kenyans. And remember that there are certain cases that have also been made where the judges who are at the very apex of those cases are no longer there, you know, and Kenyans know, and we all know sometimes how the politics play in within what we expect that is supposed to be a space where we can be able to see a clear distinction between judicial authority and, of course, constitutional interpretation. But we don't see it because the faces of the political class come in and cloud it. And even for this one, I wouldn't be quite surprised if the ruling party, and now it is broad-based, or whether bread-based, would want to formulate certain narratives around it. Because we have had politicians saying, we will go to Bunge and change the law and make it fit us to, you know, look like what you want to see. Even for this matter, those political narratives would probably cloud Professor's eyes to the level of, you know, making him look so big at the expense of what the rule, the laws have said, and indeed what the Constitution expects of a professor of law like himself. So it's of course a paradox to look at what he would do as that individual against the political party's requirements, and especially given the kind of context that we saw. Wakili Kithi began by giving us an analogy of the president and his deputy. Yeah. Whether this was a designate deputy president then, because remember we were also told, oh, you know, there were names, Mheshimiwa William Ruto was given names, and the president has also come out very expressly, and he said, this was my preferred candidate actually. The gentleman you gave to me was this and that. It is politics playing. And so even for this one, we are looking forward to seeing how the president, again, remember, we also said it here during that time, that President Ruto's silence really was speaking so loudly and voluminously in the impeachment processes of his deputy president. So even for this one, we will be looking forward to seeing the angle that the president takes, whether he is going to be that gentleman who will be sending Kenyans to the angle of constitutional implementation, respect to the rule of law, court orders, or he will be releasing, you know, the people that speak for government and saying, Professor, you must stay put. These courts have done this, they have done that. We don't have to respect them. Because then Kenyans would be left asking, so what do we do? Is the deputy president in office legally? Is he in office illegally? Is he illegitimate? Is it a null and void scenario? Or where do we actually head to seek for justice?
Okay.
In my view, again, it would be quite important to look at the authorities of judicial officers and what that means to separation of powers and indeed the running of a government. So that what does the executive do in the case like where we find ourselves now? Then what is Parliament as another arm of government supposed to do as the people who make these laws and then submit them to the judiciary to interpret and the executive to implement what is expected?
Okay.
So how will these three angles be playing, especially when we look at very heavy pronouncements that have been made by the Court of Appeal against what Kenyans would be seeking to see, which is constitutional implementation?
Okay.
Again, as I finish, Kenya Kwanza government has not done very well in terms of helping us implement this constitution. So how we move forward in terms of looking at their parameters of understanding, again in the backdrop of the heated campaigns that are ongoing, whether we want to say stay put, Bwana DP, or we allow Mheshimiwa Gachagua to come in as we await this, the other empanelment, and then what will the judiciary do within the 14 days? Are they going to respect those court orders, and will then the executive respect the outcome of those orders in the event that, again, the bench that will be put in place agree that indeed the process and not the issues, because there were 11 issues that were set up for impeachment. But then the issue in question is the process of the impeachment, which again, actually, you remember that both of us here, agreed that that process was not as watertight as to warrant an impeachment of a deputy president.
Okay, so from what I'm gathering, and I hope I'm correct, then regarding Gachagua is sort of vindicated?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Not yet, because he hasn't been heard. He was heard, and the return was negative. He didn't get what he was asking for. But he's supposed to be heard again. So he has a chance to be heard again because a new bench is going to be constituted. But let me put it this way.
Yeah.
That question will be answered in the context of when there's competition and friction between law and politics. Politics ordinarily is dominant because it speaks immediately, reacts immediately, and it has the highest decibels. The law is quiet and silent only in a text. So whereas politics will flip in the air, it will make so much noise. When the dust settles, it is the law that ordinarily eventually dominates and then creates the space for the sobriety of what will be the relationship and the rights of people eventually. Okay. So to the extent that...
What is otherwise called reason.
Yes.
Yeah, reason.
So to the extent that there was the political decibel at the highest and ethnicity and all the madness that we saw at the time, we knew that everybody would succumb to the politics of the day as opposed to the law. But the law took its time. It took months. It took months and months, but it has pronounced itself in a manner as to vulgarize the political process as was then. So what I believe is the rule of law may not have immediate results, but consequently, if pursued to the latter, it provides the results.
So can he vie for a political seat at the moment?
You see, the impeachment didn't happen.
Okay.
It didn't happen because the court that stopped the impeachment, the setting aside of the orders against the impeachment was illegal. So we only stopped to the extent that there were orders that stopped the impeachment process. And therefore, it doesn't mean that if the Kerugoya court, for instance, with orders that impeachment should not take place, had been had, maybe it would have allowed impeachment process to go on. But we didn't get to that because we saw events where a bench of 3 judges took over the hearing of the matter, assumed jurisdiction over the matter, presided over the matter, and made a decision now seemingly set aside, seemingly vulgarized by the decision. Okay. Let me not use vulgarized because, I'm a lawyer, I always go to those courts. So let me say it was set aside by the Court of Appeal. And therefore, we will say that as we speak, Gachagua has no impeachment on him to that extent.
Okay, one more question. So then, was his presidential bid, his announcement yesterday, was it premature, for lack of a better word?
Yes, it was.
Okay.
It was. He may be shocked that the return will be the same. He may also be shocked. Okay, we may be shocked that the return is different. So it depends on how this, because the case is yet to be heard. And remember, it has been taken back to the High Court.
Yeah.
The High Court will hear it. No pressure anymore, because then there was pressure.
Yeah.
Now it will be heard in a space of availability of time where lawyers are going to argue and judges will take the time to make the decision. Then, and with a background of knowledge of already arguments that have been presented, there won't be different arguments. The papers that were filed remain the same. All right? The arguments remain, the context remains the same. It's just that now there's space and latitude. Then now, after that, remember, parties will go to the Court of Appeal, whichever the results. Then there's the Supreme Court. So we are in it still.
Okay.
Yes.
But we're likely to see the whole process being rushed, because it's a matter of,
Public interest?
Yeah.
Was a matter of public interest.
No,
For
it's
now,
not.
I don't think Kindiki wants it rushed. I don't think so.
Politics.
As he occupies the office. But the flip side of it, Gachagua would want it rushed, because he wants probably to get the decision earlier before the general election. In fact, good space enough for him to make his political decision as to where he's vying or what coalition he's presenting. But also what it does for purposes of the optical sense of it, it gives Rigathi Gachagua some sense of vindication as to the outcry he had. Remember, he took the country through volumes and volumes of his own presentation of his case.
Yes.
And said, this is wrong, this is wrong. And I do think that it gives him probably some rendition of, aggrandizement that,
Okay.
I was right all along, and that this was just politics.
Okay.
In fact, the question of believability is what he assumes now, that he can be believed more if you put the two sides, which side then seems to be by the public being believed. And remember this, there are two ways in administration of a country. There's the legality of administration and the legitimacy of administration. Now, legality can be questioned. It's the law that says who should be president, for instance, and which government should run the country.
Yeah.
Legitimacy is whether the people accept the situation as is because of the bounding circumstances, for instance, taxes, economic issues, political issues of abduction. So your legitimacy keeps on going up and down.
Okay.
This presses a question as to the legitimacy of the occupier, of the current occupier, of the deputy president in Kindiki, Professor Kindiki, as to whether he legitimately can pronounce himself before members of the public and present himself legitimately as the deputy president that he represents, me and you and any other person, in the context of the challenges that he faces.
All right, Osido, coming to you. I mean, it's all about politics and optics. And as he's mentioned, Rigathi Gachagua seems to be emboldened by that particular ruling. He even announced that he's about to form a party, launch a party this week. But this complicates the matter for this opposition that is coming together. I mean, if you look at the interest, we have Wiper leader Kalonzo Musyoka, who's interested in the presidency. Now Rigathi Gachagua says he's interested. Fred Matiang'i also entered into that particular picture. Let's not forget Martha Karua. I mean, will they band together, looking at the interests they each have?
Actually, the truth of the matter is that our elections are won by baskets of votes who are human beings. Us, exactly. So to the extent that you are able to mobilize the numbers, the threshold is 50% plus one across about 24 counties. And so all this mobilization that we see taking place is for them to be able to ask, ultimately when they retreat and they lock themselves outside the glares of the cameras and all that, wewe uko na watu wangapi na wewe unaleta wangapi. And so to the person that will be able to bring in the heaviest basket, so the likely event that that person will be the flag bearer of this new emerging opposition will be based on the number of votes that you're able to commandeer. Now, the interesting thing again is that part of what we continue to see is this distrust by government. I mean, of course, Kenyans not having a lot of faith and belief in their own government or in this government now is broad-based. But even in the manner of the formation of the broad-based government is based on how do we mobilize as many people who, of course, to stabilize government was seen to be opposition, but now coming into government to stabilize. And the president has been clear about this. The former Prime Minister, Mheshimiwa Raila Amolo Odinga, has been clear about this, that the handshake is supposed to help the president to stabilize the country. Now, this is a new gap that the opposition is seeking to fill. Because if you look at the trust levels and the believability ratios of Kenya Kwanza and Kenyans, it keeps going down. Yeah. Why? Because the government is not meeting the expectations of Kenyans. So every day, something comes up which is political, and it gives more fodder to the political class, rather to the new emerging opposition, as opposed to the government centralizing its message on service delivery and delivering on what Kenyans wanted, which is why, in my view, I'm looking forward to seeing how the president will craft a new message against this new emerging, bolstered and strengthened Rigathi Gachagua, and in addition to the opposition, which even as you mentioned, the big political heads, we have this new emerging, very salient, silent opposition called the Gen Z. And of course the Kenyans who just feel disenfranchised and they're like, yeah, we are looking for a new breed, a new voice. And this is more than 10.9 million votes. 10.9 million new votes. So whether you organize around big heads who have been there in the opposition or not, ultimately the vote is a secret ballot. And even as I am saying that this organizing is based on the number of people that you're able to mobilize, if the system works very well, then we are going to be given very interesting surprises, where we might not for the first run achieve the 50% plus one, because Kenya Kwanza will come and probably with ODM, so the broad-based government, then you have the opposition, and then in between you have the 10.9 million Gen Z movement, or this new girl power that is emerging. So how we move over from, say, election 2027 post the first run-up, the run-up to the election, and then we are given again the time to reorganize now for the 50% plus one, that in my view is going to be the determinant. But as things stand right now, if elections were to be called today, I do not think that with all these things that are happening, including the bolstered Rigathi Gachagua and the Mount Kenya outcry and the kind of confusion that we have seen in government, I do not think that President William Ruto would win that election. And you've talked about elections, and one of the key factors in this particular elections is the IEBC. The nominees list was released last week, and there are some concerns that have been brought forward by Kenyans. We'll be looking at that shortly after the break.